John.
Hey, George.
How are you?
Pretty good. And you?
Good. I had the weirdest thing happen last night. I was interviewed on the Roseanne Barr radio show.
Roseanne Barr, you mean who
Roseanne
used to be
Barr.
the Roseanne, the TV star?
Yeah. She used to have a show, right?
Yeah, it was one of the most popular.
Show?
It was one of the most popular shows on TV for like 10 years, I think.
That's so strange. So a few days ago, I get this phone call from New York, and it's Booker, and he says, Roseanne wants to do a show on meditation and neurotheology.
That's great.
Well, I think he just said meditation at that point, and then later they billed it as neurotheology, and it's a talk call-in show out of a station in California, except she was talking from Las Vegas, Nevada, where she's appearing, as a comedy act at some casino. So we talked about that stuff that we wrote about in Slate, and of course I used this to put in a plug for bloggingheads.tv. So
oh my God, you're kidding.
Maybe we can expand our audience, but yeah, it was kind of an odd conversation. We got into all this, and then it kind of turned into science and religion. And
well, how was she as an? I just got to say, George Johnson and Roseanne Barr brings about cognitive dissonance in my brain.
Well,
but how was she?
Well, guess who? Last week she had Noam Chomsky on for an hour.
Oh, you're kidding?
No, it's.
Wow, she's really ambitious. She sounds like she's got a lot of intellectual content on her show.
Well, it's her and someone else, and they kind of talk back and forth, and mostly she just sort of seems to be on this real anti-religion kick, and her religion is truth, and science will find the answers, and why are people afraid of it? So, it wasn't exactly, we didn't get into a lot of details, but she was a very, very nice person to talk to for an hour.
Yeah, well, God, I'm envious. I'd love to talk to Roseanne Barr.
I mentioned you. Yeah.
Oh, well, good. Thank you. Well, that was, I loved that show back in the 80s. Susie and I used to watch it avidly.
Oh, you would have been perfect. And well, you may get a call because the guy who's the producer, he also called in at one point, and he wanted to talk about psychedelic drugs. And I said, you really need to talk to my friend John Horgan. And he said, oh, yes, I know that name.
Yeah, he's the expert. Horgan's the expert on psychedelic drugs. Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I used that to refer people to bloggingheads.tv, and then,
that's
anyway,
brilliant, George.
Wait for a call from Rosie.
Man, you are so you're good at this media stuff.
No, not really.
I don't know. You're too modest. I think making a connection with Roseanne Barr, you can't get better than that.
I really like radio though, because people can't see you. You can just kind of walk around and just talk, and
Yeah, unlike Blogging Heads, where I spend at least a half hour, 45 minutes primping before I go on the show. I don't know about you.
Well, I'm playing tennis, right?
Yeah, that's what I did this morning. So, hey, I figured, I was putting together some, jotting down ideas over the last week for topics we could talk about.
Yeah.
And without my realizing it, it all came up animals, and even more than that, birds and bees.
Oh, yeah, the great disappearance of the bees.
Yeah, so you saw, this was in the Science Times 2 Tuesdays ago,
yeah.
I guess.
And it wasn't it pegged to some conference on bee disappearance?
Yeah. Well, I guess this is sort of a big ongoing story, but I hadn't realized how bad it was. I did a little story in Scientific American about 15 years ago on some of the problems in the bee industry, and they had various parasites and so forth, and the populations were down a little bit, but now it's catastrophic, I guess.
Oh.
I think they said.
I had thought that there was a big splash about this a few years ago, and I remember, a friend coming to my house from Albuquerque looking in the yard and saying, wow, you must be the last, place in the world that has bees. And we had bees all over the place. But there were stories then about bees disappearing. But you say now it's gotten worse.
Well, according to the article, about 25% of the bee colonies in the United States have collapsed.
Yeah.
And this is really a serious economic problem because I hadn't realized this until I read this factoid in the article. About 1/3 of the food we eat depends on bee pollination.
Yeah.
So they are a huge part of agriculture in the United States and worldwide. And I guess nobody can figure out what exact reason is driving this collapse of the population here. I mean, they've proposed almost every possible cause, and nobody can really pinpoint which one it is exactly.
So maybe a combination of parasites, and isn't there a virus that they were?
Well, I guess just through a coincidence last weekend, after I read this article, Susie and I went to an open house at this big farm near here, and a friend of ours was giving a talk about beekeeping. This guy named Rodney Dow. It turns out that he's been a beekeeper since he was a kid. He's been keeping bees for 45 years.
Yeah.
And he gave this talk basically about what's happening to the bees, and he said that it was all of the above. He thought it was pesticides, fungicides. He thought that bees have been too artificially manipulated by big commercial beekeepers. They use artificial insemination now for bees. They give them these highly artificial foods made out of fructose and sucrose that aren't as healthy for them. They're cheaper, but they're not as healthy as the bees' natural foods.
So they've been totally industrialized.
Yes.
Well, I was just amazed reading this article. Something I didn't know, that there are these commercial bee operations, and they drive around the country, I guess throughout the Midwest and California and other big farming regions, with these 18-wheeler semi-trailer trucks full of bees.
Right.
I just imagine, I just get this image of this, this big rig going down the road, and the guy talking on his CB radio, and in back there's a million bees buzzing around in this trailer. I mean, I guess actually they're hives, and then they set the hives out, and they basically rent hive time to all these big agri-businesses. Yeah,
and I guess there's some beekeepers. In fact, this guy Rodney Dow said that he thought that shipping the bees around wasn't good for them either.
Yeah, the stress.
Yeah.
But that's what amazed me. I assumed that, when they, even in the biggest agriculture regions and these big corporate farms, I just assumed that pollination relied on the insects that happened to be around there or that were attracted there, because there was all this pollinating opportunities. But it never occurred to me that people actually truck the bees in and rent their pollination time, and that it's this huge industry.
I guess it's such an important part of some of these crops that they can't rely on the bees to do it naturally.
Wow.
So they have to do it in this artificial way. I just got to tell you a couple of great quotes that this guy had on this talk, Rodney Dow, last week. He said that Rudolf Steiner, this sort of mystic intellectual who founded the Waldorf schools, was a beekeeping fanatic, and he predicted in 1923 that within the next century, because of the commercialization of beekeeping and all these artificial measures that were being introduced to beekeeping, there would be a collapse of bee populations.
And how long ago was this?
That was 1923.
Wow.
And apparently Rudolf Steiner was friends with Albert Einstein. And Einstein apparently once said, and I found this on the web, I haven't been able to trace it to a specific source, but Einstein apparently once said that if bees vanish, humans will vanish within 4 years.
Wow. Boy, that's
something
scary.
else to worry about. Forget terrorism. Forget global warming.
Yeah.
We should worry about the bees.
Well, of course, it makes you wonder if it seems like if a terrorist wanted to bring down the civilized world, the thing to do would be to spread some sort of engineered bee-killing virus.
Oh my God, George! We might have
I have to admit, I watched that 24 show that you referred me to. So yeah, that would make a good plot for 24, actually, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Oh, you wanted to see how your doppelganger Jack Bauer was doing.
Yeah, I actually downloaded the two-part season premiere to try to get a sense of it. But
watch out! You're going to be addicted.
Well, it definitely grabbed me. So
yeah,
I don't know how strongly, but that's quite alarming about the bees.
Yeah. So this guy. Apparently, some people just think that bees are in fact, Rodney Dow used this phrase, the canaries in the coal mine. That they are extremely sensitive to environmental conditions. And so it probably is lots of different factors that are driving this decline. It's similar to, there was a big article in the Science Times this week, I think, on the decline of coral around the world.
Yeah, the Corey Dean's article. And I guess that was attributed to, a confluence of environmental degradation along with possibly global warming.
Yeah.
But the bee thing it's not, I guess, everywhere. Here in New Mexico, apparently, it hasn't been declared a problem. There was we had a front page story on it actually in the local paper, which was probably kind of a follow-on to the Times piece, and the reporter talked to beekeepers, and most of them said they weren't seeing that collapse here, although she did talk to one down in southern New Mexico who said that he had lost some huge number of hives just over the winter, and he wasn't yet sure what the cause was and if this was part of the same syndrome. And there too, the reporter then talked to like a relative of his in Colorado who was also a beekeeper, and it was this whole family thing. They all drive around bringing these bees to California, and it's just amazing to me when you discover this whole little corner of the world that you didn't know existed.
It's almost like a cult. The people who are really into bees talk about them they are so into them. They get so fascinated with bees. And I remember reading up on them. It reminded me of a story I did, again, for Scientific American about, 15 or 20 years ago on research on the bee waggle dance.
Oh, yeah. And that is it some kind of a communication, right? It's a language. This
was discovered by a scientist named Carl von Frisch back in the 40s, and he actually won a Nobel Prize for it. And he said that, so if you've got a bee that's going out and foraging for pollen, it comes back to the hive, and it does this bizarre dance. It sort of walks around in circles and waggles its rear end. Yeah. And Frisch decoded this and said that the orientation of the bee relative to the direction of the sun gave the direction to the flower field or whatever where the bee had just gathered its pollen. And the length of the dance supposedly indicated the distance of the field.
Is that held up?
It's apparently, I was just checking it on Wikipedia, my all-purpose source now, and apparently it's somewhat controversial. There's some people who still think that most bee communication occurs through odor, but there's this group that created an artificial bee, so it didn't have any odor at all, and the artificial bee could do the bee dance. And they said that they could get bees in the hive to fly off to specific spots by doing artificial dances according to the code that von Frisch had discovered.
Huh. And they had, by artificial bee, you mean it was...
It's a little robot.
Oh, a robot!
Yeah, a little robot bee.
Oh!
That was stuck in the hive.
Obviously it wasn't squirting out pheromones. So.
No smell at all.
Wow. So that's a pretty sophisticated means of communication.
Yeah, again, this goes back. This is the story that I did, 15 years ago. So I guess it wasn't definitive because there still are people with doubts. But it's just sort of another indication of how fascinating these little creatures. I mean, they're obviously important, but they're also really interesting little creatures.
Well, like ants, and this whole idea that the intelligence isn't in the individual ant, but it's in the colony, so that the ant is like a neuron in this brain, which is the ant colony.
Yeah.
Douglas Hofstadter wrote some great things about that, and Gödel Escher Bach.
Oh yes,
Aunt Hillary. He named the ant hill.
Yes, a scientific cult classic, Gödel Escher Bach.
Oh, it's wonderful! It's one of the best books I've ever read.
Hey, speaking of little astonishing creatures, I don't know if you have hummingbirds. In Santa Fe. We have this group that comes every single summer. Susie has been writing down the day on which they arrive for 8 or 9 years now, and they always come exactly on May 1st, give or take a day.
Really?
So they came this year on, we first saw them at about 7 o'clock p.m. On April 30th.
Oh. Well, that's about, I think we beat you by a couple of weeks. We probably got him in mid-April, but just very few so far. But
Which kind do you have?
Oh, I don't know a lot about them. I know there's one called a Rufus.
Yes, kind of a dull. We have the ruby-throated, which have that really bright neck.
Yeah, I don't really know the names, but they just go crazy on certain types of flowers that we have in the backyard.
Yeah, they hummingbirds are. Apparently they also disappear on the same day every year. And from here, these ruby-throated hummingbirds, which are, they're tiny. They're like the size of a moth. Yeah. And they migrate all the way down to Central America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The ones here, they're on a circuit, mostly to Mexico, like Chihuahua, northern Mexico, and there's some canyons in southern Arizona, like Ramsey Canyon, that's maintained by the Nature Conservancy, where you can see huge amounts of hummingbirds, and they burn this amazing amount of energy, just vibrating their little wings.
I guess they need to eat about 2 times their weight every day.
Yeah. So all they do is eat.
But the idea that these little things with, their brains must be smaller than peas, and that they can navigate from here down to Costa Rica or Nicaragua year after year.
No, is there evidence that I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, they come back, and I guess there is, it's still sort of mysterious how they do this, but they banned them, but they haven't put radio transmitters on them because they haven't designed a radio transmitter small enough so that it wouldn't interfere with the hummingbird's flight. And even banning them is sort of controversial.
Oh, well, yeah, they're so tiny. It's not like doing a peregrine falcon or something.
Right.
Yeah.
But Susie swears that she can recognize the adults who come back here year after year. And,
as individuals?
Yeah, as individuals. Well, Susie has this kind of connection. My wife, Susie, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but she's a wild bird rehabilitator.
Yeah, that's right. I remember.
So if people find a bird that's fallen out of its nest, a baby bird, or a hawk that's been hit by a car or whatever, they bring them to Susie, and she tries to nurse them back to health and release them into the wild. So she's got
that's great.
She's got licenses to do this, and she goes to seminars around the country and so forth.
So do you have them? Do you keep them at home while they're being rehabilitated?
Yeah. Yes, we've got a 400 square foot flight cage in our backyard, and a couple of smaller cages. She's got a little clinic where she bandages the birds, and if they're severely injured, she keeps them in there so she can keep a close eye on them. But We also sometimes have them in the house. We've had a couple of great blue herons in our bedroom bathroom.
Wow.
And that's actually, I'm not crazy about that because they have to be fed fish, and it gets a little smelly in there after a while.
Yeah.
But that brings me to another topic I wanted to talk about, more to do with birds.
Animals.
Yeah. There was a really interesting article in Scientific American in the April issue on ravens. The title was, let's see, How Smart Are Ravens?
Yeah.
By a guy named Bernd Heinrich, who is an authority on corvids, ravens and crows. He wrote a great book called The Mind of the Raven, and it's him and a former student of his wrote this article about some experiments they've done demonstrating how clever ravens are.
Mm-hmm.
So one of these
tools, supposedly, right, in a very crude way.
Well, in this particular set of experiments, it was pretty simple. It wasn't really tool using, but they hung food from a string, and so the raven is sitting on a branch, and there's a string tied around the branch, and there's a piece of meat that's dangling at the bottom of the string.
Yeah.
And the scientists wanted to see if the raven could figure out how to pull it up. And what was remarkable is that there was no trial and error. These adult ravens just looked at the setup for like 30 seconds or a minute, and then very methodically pulled the string up with their beak, and then would clamp it down with one foot, pull again, clamp it down with the foot again, and get the meat in that way.
Yeah, so it seemed like they were putting together some sort of fairly complex step-by-step strategy. And
that's right.
Yeah.
So the feeling was, we have crows who live with us all the time. Susie's rehabbing crows all the time, and this article didn't really strike me as being, it was interesting, but it was interesting in part because the scientists seemed to be presenting this as so remarkable that a raven could figure out how to do this.
But you see this all the time.
Yeah, so we have, I'll just tell you, probably the amazing thing that I've ever seen a corvid do, or a bird do of any kind. Susie had a crow called George a few years ago.
Good name.
Yeah, George. There are actually two of them, George and Gracie. And George was a foundling. Susie raised him. Then she released him into the wild. And sometimes these crows just hang out with us for a while.
Yeah.
And they get a kick out of goofing on us. And so I was upstairs working, tapping on my laptop, and I suddenly hear all this commotion outside. I hear my kids yelling. I hear Susie yelling. And so I go down to see what's going on. And they told me that the kids, my son and daughter, had been in this, it's like an 8-foot square cage, and it's got a little bolt latch on the door.
Mm-hmm.
And they always like to lock each other into this cage. And so both of them were inside the cage, and they said that George had flown over to the door, which was ajar, and had flapped his wings, closing the door, and had locked them inside the cage.
Yeah.
By this time, so the kids had been yelling to get let out by Susie.
Wow.
So I came down. Well, this is what they told me. Being a skeptic, I didn't believe it. I thought they were pulling my leg.
Yeah, and it could have just happened semi-randomly.
Yeah. So I found it hard to believe. So I went into so I sort of cleared everybody out. I went into the cage myself and left the door ajar. Then I sort of looked around, pretended I wasn't paying attention to George. Out of the corner of my eye, I see George fly over to the door. He clung to it. This is a screen door. Mm-hmm. And flapped his wings so the door shut. And then he took his beak and slipped the latch over and locked me in. And then I swear, I thought I saw him smile at me.
Wow. So that almost seems like, you're saying that crows may be conscious.
Well, certainly they're intelligent. I mean, obviously he's just been watching the kids do this, but what amazes me and is that crows have, I think that's evidence of a sense of humor.
Or it was just, did it just learn to mimic this what would you say, this process of, putting the bolt in the door, but just the fact that it would be able to observe something like that and make a mental picture of it and then figure out how to do it itself is remarkable, whether or not it actually did it because it wanted to trap you in the cage.
Yeah, it's, I think that with these animals, a lot of animal science, the science of observing animal behavior and trying to figure out what it means, I think is still corrupted by behaviorism, which really dominated animal studies for decades. And behaviorists said you shouldn't even think about what's going on in the mind of an animal.
Yeah, which in a way, I mean, partly that was in reaction to people just reading too much into it because there's, such a danger of over-interpreting.
That's right.
It's really easy to convince yourself that, like, a simple machine has intentions and...
Right.
Like, people, think their cars have personalities, or at least they act like it, and, I do myself sometimes. So it's, it's easy to get into some sloppy thinking, so I can see what the behaviorists were saying, but they went a little too far.
Well, they're trying to clean up the field. It seems to me that behaviorism, and also this sort of aversion of some scientists to anthropomorphic explanations of what animals do, I can understand that some of the anthropomorphism went too far, but it seems to me that the lesson of evolutionary biology is that we have a lot in common with animals.
Well, and it's the whole argument about whether animals are conscious. On one hand, people like Derek Bickerton have made, I think, some really good arguments that to really have anything like human awareness and consciousness, you really have to have language and syntax and the ability to be able to form arbitrarily complex thoughts. But on the other hand, in an evolutionary grounded theory, it just seems unlikely that consciousness would suddenly spring up at one, level of development and not have, dim little glimmers further down.
Yeah. There's this, one of the really interesting areas of animal research now, sort of animal cognition, has to do with, first of all, whether animals have what scientists sometimes call a theory of mind concept, where you can where you instantly and innately infer that other creatures, in our case, other humans, have a mind, and you predict their actions based on this assumption and inference that they have a mental life just like you do.
Right, and then so and isn't there some research suggesting that autistic children lack that ability, or that it's diminished?
Yeah, and so for autistic children, they have to learn sort of through trial and error and experience that humans have minds, that humans are going to do certain things, that if humans have a certain expression, that indicates that they're feeling in a certain way. But they have to learn it entirely, whereas for most of us it comes effortlessly.
Yeah, possibly because of these mirror neurons.
Right. Yes, the mirror neurons.
Right, that's all related to that. But whether it's mirror neurons or whether it's something where it's a network of neurons, it's very basic to humanity anyway. And then, what do they think about? I mean, do crows?
Well, this article by Bern Heinrich actually addressed this too. They did some experiments that tested whether a crow, so you have a crow with some food, and crows typically will, if they have more food that they can eat than they can eat at one time, they'll try to hide it.
Yeah.
And so they have a situation where you have a crow with some food, and there is another crow who's looking at them while they have the food and watching them when the first crow with the food is trying to hide it. And then there will be other crows who can't see the first crow when it has the food.
Yeah.
And the crow with the food will act very differently when, let's say, all the crows are released then. And the crow with the food will act very differently toward the crows that it knows have been watching it with the food.
Oh.
Than it will towards the crows that don't know that it has hidden the food. I haven't expressed that very well, but basically,
I get the point, though. Yeah.
Yeah, the crow can distinguish between crows that have knowledge or lack of knowledge about its own possession of the food.
Yeah.
And that's thought to be indication of theory of mind capacity.
Huh.
And again, it just seems, I guess, I've seen crows engage in such complicated behavior just around our house that doesn't seem all that surprising to me.
Yeah. Boy, it's just the fact that you can't interview the crow about what it's thinking makes it probably, impossible to ever really know. But because I imagine you could come up with a very complex, possibly convoluted behaviorist explanation for all of that just based on stimulus and response links. And
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, of course, you can come up with a complicated explanation that humans don't have consciousness too.
Oh, yeah. It's some of that early literature is really, it's quite impressive as far that they were able to take that idea so far.
Yeah. Another interesting area I'm sure you've read about. Have you heard of something called the mirror test? The mirror test of consciousness.
Is it where like they have a chimp look at itself in the mirror and see if and see if it can recognize that it's looking at itself. So you've got theory of mind, which is the ability to recognize that others have minds. Yeah.
Then there is the question of whether animals have anything like self-awareness.
Yeah.
And there's something called the mirror test that is supposed to be able to determine this. So you basically just put an animal in front of a mirror, and there are various ways where you can try to tell whether the animal is recognizing itself in the mirror. As opposed to, for example, you put most birds in front of a mirror, and they will peck at it and even sort of ruffle their feathers and act in a hostile way, as though they're just seeing another bird.
Yeah.
But
how about crows?
Well, I just read an article online that said that crows can't recognize themselves, but Susie, my wife, did a test with actually George and Gracie, these crows that I was mentioning before, where she just put a mirror in front of them and just watched what they did. She said that George stared at the mirror and then he walked around behind it to see if there was a crow behind it. Gracie, there's a little plate of food next to it. Gracie would methodically pick up pieces of food and go in front of the mirror and sort of look at herself holding the food, then go drop that piece of food, bring another one back. And she said she speared a grape once, and it was on the bottom, her bottom beak, and was kind of clapping her beak back and forth. Mm-hmm. And Susie thought that this clearly meant that Gracie recognized herself and realized that she was looking at an image of herself in the mirror. Yeah.
I mean, part of the trouble is that we humans are so good at our theories of mind that, we can see them where they may be and may not be.
Yeah, it's tough.
That sounds pretty persuasive. But,
it's like the old Thomas Nagel essay, What is it like to be a bat?
Yeah, it's kind of the ultimate existential question, and just the whole question of consciousness. And
right.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting. There's this British philosopher, David. His name will probably come to me after we stop talking, but who basically argues that consciousness is just the one, obviously, most basic fact of all of our lives, the one thing that, we experience most directly, there's no really way to say it, it's just really everything in some ways, and then it only makes sense to start a science from the assumption of consciousness as your most basic thing and then build on top of that instead of starting with some kind of insentient physics and then trying to use that to explain consciousness. David Chandler, maybe?
Oh, Chalmers.
David Chalmers. But,
Chalmers, yes.
Yeah, I may be overstating what he says, but it's an interesting. It would just be like taking our whole paradigm, if I can use that word,
sure,
of science and turning it all inside out and basing it on this consciousness, which I guess is sort of similar to some old Germanic mystical philosophies and things that were, sort of as opposed to the British empirical school.
Yeah, there's the question is, there's some philosophers and even scientists who think that consciousness is a special kind of scientific problem and that it might not be solvable scientifically in the same way that, say, photosynthesis is, or I don't know, even genetic transmission, which are sort of, materialistic problems. And there's this phrase called the explanatory gap that a philosopher named David Levine coined to get at the idea that you have sort of materialistic explanations here, the behavior of neurons and neurotransmitters and so forth, and then you have these subjective states that constitute consciousness, and they just seem to be fundamentally different categories.
Yeah, so is he a dualist, saying that mind is some ineffable essence separate from the body?
I think he's just saying he's a materialist, and he thinks that you can advance on the problem scientifically by studying neural behavior and so forth. But there will always be this gap because the two sets of phenomena are so different in kind.
Yeah.
There's this other term called Mysterianism.
Yeah, the new Mysterians.
The new Mysterians.
Yeah, was that Colin somebody?
Colin McGinn.
Colin McGinn, yeah. He has a really good book on that.
That's right. The notion that maybe consciousness won't be.
They just can't explain it. And
right.
Some people like Patricia Churchland. She's kind of a philosopher / neuroscientist at UC San Diego, and then she, I think really recoils at that idea that it's kind of, very anti-scientific.
Yeah, well, it might be the same case that you have with quantum mechanics. So you might come up with a theory of consciousness or a theory of mind that is very powerful, that has lots of practical consequences, that allows you to predict neural and mental behavior, that leads you to come up with better models of mental illness and better treatments for mental illness. So it has all these positive effects, just as quantum mechanics has. Mm-hmm. But still, there's this fundamental mystery left. So quantum mechanics...
You can still argue over what it means.
Right.
Whatever means.
Right.
Yeah. That's the interesting thing. Whenever you write about quantum mechanics, I'm sure you've found this too. You'll always get these emails from physicists, and they tend to be graduate students of physicists or recent PhDs saying, "Oh, you're just contributing to the public misunderstanding. There's nothing mysterious about quantum mechanics. It just says da 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 da." And and the older physicists generally won't complain and say that because they've lived with the mystery long enough to know that you can have this perfectly wonderful theory that makes these precise mathematical predictions of reality, and still it's a matter of opinion as far as how you interpret it. That's something that happens on this meta level that where there's just no mechanism to agree.
Well, let me ask you. I mean, you wrote. I I have to agree with you. I've tried to write, I have written about quantum mechanics. I wrote a big feature article about all these experiments that were trying to kind of expose quantum weirdness. I did this article about 10 years ago for Scientific American, and normally when you're writing an article, you hope that the harder you study the material, the more you understand it.
Yeah.
And what was disconcerting about quantum mechanics is that it was the opposite. I felt as though the more I hold on, let me just.
Okay, sure.
The more I studied it, the more baffled I became by the whole topic.
Yeah.
But you wrote this great book on quantum computation.
Oh, right.
That came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah, Shortcut Through Time.
Yeah. So, I figured you probably understand quantum mechanics as well as anybody can. I wonder what, if we're going to tie quantum mechanics back to consciousness. What,
like Roger Penrose.
Yeah. What do you think about that whole set of explanations, whether quantum mechanics might have something to do with consciousness?
Yeah. To me, that's kind of seemed like taking the two biggest mysteries in science, the two possibly most impenetrable questions: what is consciousness, and what is the happening in the quantum realm, and then saying, well, since we have these two mysteries, maybe they're the same mystery, and I'm not sure that they get much further than that. You have this guy that's worked with Penrose a little bit in Arizona. He's a
Stuart Hameroff.
Yeah, Stuart Hameroff, and he has this whole theory about these, the computations going on quantum mechanically inside the neurons, and
yeah.
And I don't, but I think it's sort of like a school of one as far as schools of thought go, and with Penrose just kind of, being interested in it because it, would provide a mechanism for his much more abstract theory, in which, as I understand Penrose's book, like in Emperor's New Mind and the ones after that, which are very difficult books, and I'm not sure I understand them, but it seems like the idea is that once you unify quantum mechanics, our theory of the very small with general relativity, or theory of the general shape of the cosmos, that it'll all come together and explain consciousness. But he's not saying this in some real new agey way. He has this very precise mathematical formulation of what that would mean.
Well, that would really be a theory of everything.
Yeah, that would be it.
A theory of the universe and of consciousness. I think the appeal to some people of a quantum mechanical explanation of consciousness is that it might allow, because of the randomness in quantum models, it might allow for free will somehow.
Oh, yeah, the free will problem. But that's kind of a funny way to be happy about having free will if it's just like a random quantum firing of one of your neurons. And,
yeah.
That could also be interpreted as the opposite of free will, couldn't it?
That's right. We're just subject to chance. I wonder if maybe it's not quantum mechanical, but it seems to me that, we talked last week about Bill Clinton neurons. And,
I wanted to get back to that because I've done a little research.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I was just going to say that, here we are talking about bees and hummingbirds and birds in general, and the incredible complexity of behavior of organisms with tiny brains.
Yeah.
And so maybe there is more going on in neurons than we think. Maybe individual neurons do have more computational power than conventional models of the brain indicate.
Well,
but anyway.
I went back and, I was curious. I went back first and I read your article in Discover a few years ago, and that was really, really neat. And then, I had forgotten that they did these experiments with epileptics who, as part of their treatment, they'll drill 10 or 12 holes in different parts of their skull, and they'll put an electrode in each one, and they find where they can stimulate the brain and use this to, control or prevent or suppress the seizures. And then these same patients volunteer to be subjects of these other experiments where they stimulate different parts of the brain using the electrodes that are already implanted for therapeutic reasons, and that's how they found the Bill Clinton neuron and the Holly Berry neuron and
the Rocky neuron,
Jennifer Aniston neuron. But
right.
This is what seems strange to me. Like, so you have 1 trillion neurons in one brain. You drill 10 holes in the skull and put in 10 electrodes, and I think each electrode had like 10 little fingers that could, be manipulated to touch different cells.
Yeah.
And then you show someone all these pictures of famous people, and suddenly one of these will light up, and you say, oh, there's the Bill Clinton neuron.
Right.
And
yeah.
There's nothing there that I could see in the paper. And I also went back and pulled the paper out of Nature and read that, and I would need to immerse myself in the literature, I'm sure, to know for sure, but I didn't see anything that would distinguish that from a theory where neuron was just one in a circuit of 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 other neurons, and that it was this whole distributed network that was lighting up, and they happened to hit one of these. Otherwise, I would think the odds that you were going to put 10 macro electrodes, say 100 total electrodes in a human brain, and you're going to happen to find one of the electrodes that was in your picture book that you were showing
right.
them.
Yeah.
That just defies.
Yeah, let me just say how, because these were the questions that I put to Christoph Koch and this guy Itzhak Fried, the neurosurgeon who did this research. First of all, they're not saying that the term grandmother cell was coined as a kind of ad absurdum explanation of how memory might work. So maybe for
I'd forgotten that was really a reductio ad absurdum.
Yeah.
It was by Jerome Letvin, right, at MIT.
Yeah, there's another guy, I thought it was Charlie Gross, maybe the two of them collaborated.
Yeah, I don't know.
But, so, one memory, one neuron. Now, what Koch, it would be impossible, as you say, the odds would be much too great to find the single, if it worked that way, to find the single neuron for Clinton or whatever. They think that probably there are many neurons that would respond to, well, first of all, with their subjects, they would ask the subjects, what's your favorite celebrity? Are there any politicians that you feel particularly strongly about? So they would select images that they thought would trigger lots of memory circuits in these people.
Yeah.
They also, but even so, they still think that there are probably lots of different neurons that are responding to a particular image. It's just that traditionally, the way perception was supposed to have worked is that you'd have neurons tuned to components of an image, to a particular color or a line oriented in a specific direction. The idea, even if there are lots of neurons that react to Bill Clinton, the idea that you could have a neuron that reacts just to Clinton. So, you're showing somebody all these different images. It lights up for Clinton, but it doesn't light up for any other images that you show this person. That's just weird. It suggests that there's some processing going on within individual neurons that nobody fully understands at this point. Another question is, the grandmother cell also is supposed to be a long-term memory cell. These might be working memory cells.
Yeah, they were in the hippocampus and the amygdala, right? And that's...
Yes,
in most models, memory isn't stored there permanently, I don't think. It's stored in the cortex, although the hippocampus is where they, it's obviously very important for setting down the memories in the first place.
Right.
I can't believe I wrote a book about this and I've just forgotten so much.
Well,
I've
these
forgotten
guys
so much about memory.
These guys sort of, right. These guys sort of bailed on the scientists sort of bailed on the question of whether these were long-term or short-term memory circuits, but they said that this sort of essential insight or discovery they still thought was really important. Just the fact that whether it was temporary tuning or long-term tuning, the fact that you had neurons attuned to something as complex as an individual person is very remarkable and
I agree.
Undercuts a lot of models about how perception is supposed to occur.
Yeah. See, that's the part where I must be missing something, because it still seems to me that this could be a circuit that's responding.
Yeah.
Responding to Clinton, and that to me doesn't seem that different from the old distributionist, how do you say it, model?
Right.
Distributed model of memory where you have this neural network that and you expose it to the world, and as you expose it, certain neurons or certain synaptic connections are strengthened, and certain synaptic connections are weakened, and in this way, through what they call Hebbian conditioning of the synapses, you're basically creating all these little circuits within in the brain. And these circuits all overlap, so that the Clinton circuit might the Bill Clinton circuit might overlap with the Hillary Clinton circuit in certain places, but not in others. And it still seems you could just be sampling one of the neurons that happen to be in the parts of these overlapping circuits that only lit up for one person and not another.
Yeah.
Without saying that the individual neurons necessarily are doing a lot more processing. And I mean, people were talking about intelligent neurons and thinking neurons as though it's a single cell that's doing this. And maybe that's true, but it just would open up all these questions about how the processing is happening intracellularly with all these little, cascades of, what is it, protein phosphorylation and all that stuff. AMP.
I think what we're circling around is there's something called the neural code, which is a phrase that neuroscientists use, but for some reason it hasn't really caught on as a well-known scientific problem outside of these little niches within neuroscience.
Yeah.
When I think it's really, I wrote an article about the neural code a couple of years ago for Discover. It actually came out before that Bill Clinton Cell article, and led to the Bill Clinton Cell article. So the neural code is the software that runs in our brains, and you can think of it as analogous to the software in a computer. So we've got our neurons are processing electrical signals that are carried by neurotransmitters in a way that is roughly analogous to a computer. But the question is, what's the code? Mm-hmm. How do our brains take these streams of electrical pulses that are going from neuron to neuron and transform them into perceptions and memories and all the things that constitute our mental life?
Right.
And if we could solve the neural code, it's possible. I think to the extent that the neural code is solvable, maybe Mysterianism is wrong. Maybe we would understand consciousness and free will. We certainly would have a much better grasp of how memory works and perception and so forth.
At least in the sense that we understand quantum mechanics, where people would still argue over interpretations. But,
that's right.
It would have to be that way, I think. And,
but you'd have a grasp of it. You'd have a grasp of it in a technical sense. It could also lead to more effective interfaces with electronic devices, interfaces between the brain and electronic devices. I mean, there are all sorts of things that could come out of cracking the neural code. The neuroscientists I've spoken to, some of them are very optimistic, but they say it's probably, it makes the genetic code look like a piece of cake. The neural code is so much more complicated. And
you get this whole problem of tangled levels of description. I mean, how can there be a genetic code? I mean, when we build computers and we program them, we devise a code, that then we impose on the system. And then the thought of how something like a code evolves like that. I mean, of course, there is the genetic code, but in that sense, it's really, it looks like a code to us when we come up with our theories of it, but the world doesn't come with labels attached, and I don't know exactly what I'm saying here, but there's something about this idea of a neural code that seems even stranger than a genetic code. Where does it come from, and does the code have the power of understanding itself? And then again, you get into all those Gödelian kind of nice things from Hofstadter.
Right. That how is it put sometimes? If we were smart enough to be able to figure out our own brains, I forget that little that sort of Zen-like paradox, but then whatever.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to. We talked about how the 1990s was declared the decade of the brain. Apparently this is the decade of the mind. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. You mean actually, officially, it's the decade of the mind?
Well, I was invited later this month to a conference. I think it's called Decade of the Mind at George Mason University, and they're actually having me moderate a panel of people like Patricia Churchland's one of them, and some of the other big neuroscientists. So I think while I'm there, I'll ask them some of these questions.
Oh yeah.
See what's the latest. And I was thinking too, it might be good. Did you say you were going to be traveling next week?
I'm going up to Boston, actually the week after next, to interview a couple of cognitive scientists. Actually, one cognitive scientist and one archaeologist.
Oh, okay. So, but if you weren't going to, you said something about one of the shows you weren't going to be able to do. Or...
Yeah, so that would be on the 18th.
Yeah, because I was thinking maybe I could get my friend Sandy Blakesley, who covers neuroscience for the New York Times, and
that's a great idea.
Yeah, she really keeps on top of this in a way that I really don't. It's not one of my main fields that I followed lately. So we can see what she wrote a great article also a couple of weeks ago about dogs and their tails.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and apparently if the tail tends to wag, is it to the left? That means the dog's pleased, and to the right, it's
I guess it depends which way you're looking at the dog.
Well, yeah, that's true. That could lead to some real confusion. I hope they controlled for that. I'm sure they did. But yeah, it was all tied into a lot of this right brain, left brain stuff.
Yeah, we have a curly-coated retriever named Merlin, who is a huge and very happy dog. He's about 120 pounds, and after I read the article, I looked at Merlin because his tail is always wagging, and he's one of these dogs. His whole rear end wags back and forth violently, so violently that it actually hurts when you catch him in full wag if he whacks you across the knee.
Maybe it's like the bee dance. And
that's right.
Yeah, we have wagging bee tails and wagging dog tails, and they both apparently have these deep meanings that we've been unaware of.
I don't know. I don't know if it's deep meaning with Merlin. I think it is just happiness. And in his case, it was. We couldn't see any asymmetry. Yeah. It's just like violent wagging back and forth on both sides.
Seemed pretty random, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to watch our cats and see if it's of course, cats don't really wag their tails in that sense, but they do. Shake them, usually when they're upset.
And
nervous, but I don't know. It was interesting. It was the most emailed story in the Times for a good part of the week. And
is that right?
Boy, anything about dogs and how to communicate with your dog and dog consciousness really gets a lot of readership, I think.
God, that's what we should be writing books about, huh?
Yeah, I guess.
Animals.
I think it's already been done. There's a lot of that out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so let's see. What else have we got? Are you?
Yeah, I don't think anything else really. One of these days we've got to talk about global warming. I mean, that's just like a perpetual issue, but it's not enough time to get into that now. I don't think.
Well, if you one possibility is. If you get Sandy on to talk about neuroscience, which is a great idea, maybe I could get, or you could also talk to him. Andy Revkin, who lives right down the street from me.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Well,
Sandy lives in Santa Fe, so I'll do a Santa Fe science writing show, and you do a Garrison show with Andy Revkin because he's doing global warming.
He's Mr. Global Warming.
Yeah, he's Mr. Global Warming, and a great guy too.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So okay, that's
it's a plan.
That's a plan. All right, so wow, here it is. We've been talking for more than an hour again.
Yeah, went fast.
Time flies. All right, George. So same time next week.
Sounds good. I'll be here.
All right, take it easy.
Okay, bye.